All right, well, we'll get started. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Coming back, as I see some folks who've been on a few of these. As you know, I took last week off, catch my breath, and we do we are back up and running, and we are set for this week, and I do have a couple people lined up for next week. So just before we talk with Michael, so Michael, obviously today. Tomorrow is Doug Elmendorf, who used to be director of the Congressional Budget Office, my former boss. And then on Friday will be Claudia Salm, who is an economist here in DC. And so we're going to turn a little bit to economics for the next couple of days, and we'll talk about that. But today, I'm very excited because I've got a good old friend of mine, Michael Brenner from Data for Change. And like always, if you have questions, put them in the chat box. There's about 24 of us, so we're kind of on that cusp of whether we can just unmute ourselves or put questions in the chat box. But let's start with the chat box today, and we'll just see how it goes. And you can unmute yourselves and just talk to Michael directly. I am just your humble moderator. Michael, do you want to maybe just start by telling folks about yourself and then talk about what Data for Change is for folks who maybe they don't know?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, my name is Michael Brenner, and I'm the head of design at Data for Change. I am by education a graphic designer and entered the data visualization landscape around 2005 when I was still living in New York City and working at a design studio called Management Design, where we did some of the books for Al Gore, Inconvenient Truth, Our Choice, and also some data visualization and graphics for the New York Times. You have to fact check me on this, but I believe that it was pre graphics studio where they were pumping out massive data visualization. So we were doing these big Sunday op-ed pieces on the Iraq and Afghanistan war and the current state of those. And then, fast forward about 10, 15 years, and now in London with Data for Change. And we are a nonprofit social change organization that helps other civil society organizations and NGOs create data-driven advocacy campaigns or projects that help with their messaging and advocacy on their day-to-day advocacy work. And so we help equip them with data literacy skills, data visualization skills, processes. And we also connect them with local, regional, and international creative talent to be able to render those projects into reality. And when I say creative teams, that usually consists of some sort of visual designer or graphic designer who has a deep focus in data visualization or editorial design. We have journalists or editorial focused team members. We also have usually like a data scientist or data researcher. And sometimes when we get the magic overlap, we get the data journalist. And then we've got also usually the hot word now, creative technologists. So developers that also have a data focus so that we can, help on the technical side. And so there's kind of four main pillars in which Data for Change helps support other civil society organizations and social change organizations. And one of the primary activities that we have or help them do that is a 5-day in-residency sprint in location. So far we've done 7, 3 in Beirut, 1 in London, 1 in Kampala, also 1 in Nairobi. I think my math's add up there. And then we bring together the team members that I just mentioned to basically lock everybody in a room for 5 days, put them together with the civil society organizations and see what comes out on the other side. And usually we get some sort of proof of concept or live prototype that we then find funding for and help the organizations carry those projects forward. While the creative teams are working, we then take the civil society organization representatives or members to separate data training skills workshops so that we're giving them the tools and knowledge and abilities to be able to take that back to their organizations and work with their in-house teams to be able to make data and data visualization and data storytelling more part of their daily advocacy work. So that's like very, very top level.
Yeah, yeah. Are there? I mean, so I'll just say again, Michael and I could talk for a while, just so everybody knows. So, but if you all have questions, just put them in the chat window. Can you talk? I want to. Well, so I have two questions for you, and but they're two very different questions. But I'll just put them out. So I wanted to ask about the tool sets and toolkits that you teach folks on the ground to use. But that's kind of the second question. The more important question I guess I wanted to ask was what are the challenges that these groups are trying to address or trying to solve? I mean, you've worked with 7 of them, so it's not, you know, what the world is trying to solve. But what are the common themes that you've seen when you're working with these groups, both technical and data related? Yeah.
So there's a myriad of topics, and usually we're specifically focused on hyper local content and serving underserved communities, and communities and organizations that either don't have direct access to some of the larger opportunities that other organizations have, and some that have just simply, I don't want to say fallen through the cracks, but are not as visible as other organizations. We've worked on quite a large number of topics, from youth perception in Yemen during the kickoff of the civil war in 2015, working with a group called Yemen Polling Center. That was quite an interesting project from a data perspective and from a design perspective of the challenges in the field. Yemen Polling Center is an organization that does public opinion polling, and they had come to our workshop in 2018 in Beirut, and they had this amazing data set of data of a survey from, from youths, I think ages 16 to about 22, and their perception of where the country was currently, what they wanted to see more of, where they thought that government was failing and what government could do better, and what their local and regional councils could be providing to ease pain points in society at that current moment. And the data set was super, super, super detailed. Their methodology was absolutely sound. But then you're now trying to create data visualizations and some sort of campaign to be able to lobby local and regional political leaders to enact change. But physically, the country's in a war zone. So you have lack of electricity, which means lack of power to devices, which also means lack of internet. You also have a population that was predominantly, I think, around 20 to 28% illiterate at the time. And with schools closing down, that could only sharply rise. So then how do you start creating data visualizations or data design to communicate with people who may not necessarily be able to read it? And that project as a whole, they came out with a couple of different executions. And one of the simplest ways was that they had produced, I think I can't remember the exact number, but they had produced an entire platform that just was dependent on 2 data visualization types. And those data visualizations each came with a voiceover, a narrative file that could be read to them. Now, the obvious, how does that a person that maybe can't necessarily read navigate to a visualization on a website? However, that's not the point. The point is to be able to share the information. So generally, if you have a phone and if you're with a group of people, that you can then share that content and help someone navigate towards that so that they can also have an understanding of what's going on. There was a little piece of tech that came out of that particular workshop that was quite interesting, where the teams came up with Raspberry Pi hubs that were basically a series of Raspberry Pi hubs that had an ability to be able to connect to the hub, and that people could basically download content and information so they could distribute it amongst governorates and to local leaders so that they could understand what was happening in the rest of the country. On the flip side of that, there was also a survey that the team had built in the back end so that they no longer had to send people out into the field, that people could connect to these hubs through the open Wi-Fi from the hub. It wasn't actually connected to the internet. And to be able to log in and fill out a survey, and every couple of weeks, those survey results would then be collected from the hubs. Now, obviously, you have to send someone into the field to actually get the hub, but then you're not sending people around to,
Right.
actually perform the surveys themselves.
The survey. That's really interesting. So you mentioned the literacy issue. There's also, I would guess, a connectivity issue,
Yes.
especially in a lot of these rural areas. So, I mean, I don't even really know what the question is. I guess the question is, how do you all think, or I guess really more, how do the partners, the people on the ground that you're working with, how do they think about us, as you mentioned, essentially creating something that is online in areas that may not have good connectivity, maybe only using cell phones, and I don't know what the quality of those phones are and the quality of the cell networks, but how does getting content to their audiences, how do they think about that?
So basically, there was two key insights that had happened at the workshop. Everybody has some sort of mobile phone, and everybody has, and all of those phones have Bluetooth. So the cool thing is that you can pass these packages and files around via Bluetooth. And the team had also figured out how to basically download the entire website in under a 5 megabyte file, so that all of the data visualizations were preserved. And if you had a phone that was not a Nokia 3600, you could open up the website in full resolution on your phone and have everything native there. Because all the visualizations are all rendered in code, there's no images.
Right.
And we had worked out a way of basically figuring out just some basic narratives that fit the different visualization types. So then you also just have a small audio file for that as well.
Right.
Now, obviously, there is inherent security risks and issues, that had to be dealt with in terms of making sure that people don't necessarily get a hold of the survey data, how much anonymity is, is recorded within that data set. And obviously, it's difficult to lock everything down, and it's really important to know what you're recording and what you're not recording.
Right. So the other question I had was on the toolkits that you're all using. So you mentioned the Raspberry Pi, which is really interesting. But what about, just because I would suspect that people on this call are interested on the data viz tools that you're working with.
So we have a suite of kind of our go-tos that we work with civil society organizations. And actually, one of our alumni from one of the earlier workshops, Giorgio Uboldi, who's part of Calibro in Milan, he and a group of people had developed Rawgraphs, which I'm sure everybody is quite familiar with, and they're going through a second round. But we use Raw a lot with just visual rapid prototyping, so people can start to investigate data sets in a visual way to understand what is the data set telling us and where should we look further. So Raw is a great way of doing that. And we also use a lot of Infogram for the civil society organizations, because there's a lot of templates and things that are pre-set up for them. We use Google Sheets to no end, and also all the little visualization techniques in there. Actually, what's really cool is during one of the workshops, we figured out a way how to link through Infogram a live Google survey, so that every time someone hits submit, it actually refreshes and you can have like a live dashboard through Infogram, which is pretty cool.
Infogram. That's interesting.
So in a lot of ways, we try to use as many open source tools and programs as possible. And if they're not, we try to work directly with those organizations or software producers to be able to get access for our civil society organizations, so that they can have at least up to a year post to be able to use the tools. So we've got Raw, we've got Infogram, we've got Google Sheets, a little bit of data or Google Data Studio here and there. One that I personally like to use is Nodebox, and that's another way of, it's from, I believe, an outfit in either Belgium, maybe even Antwerp. It was developed at a university, and basically it's kind of like a Lego-esque connectivity interface that you can plot in certain metrics of your data and see how that's visualized. So you can set up a couple of different visualizations and it will just output it. It's like a basic version of processing. If processing had more of an interface.
Right. Yeah, more of a GUI on it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more visual, and being a visual person, it makes more sense. And also Flourish, Nodebox.
Nodebox. All right,
Yeah, and then Flourish has been great in terms of being able to add interactivity to charts and graphs and visualizations, and Flourish with shorthand is also really great. So anything that can be embedded also into shorthand, because one of the ways that we use shorthand is a way for civil society organizations to publish data stories or long form journalism pieces with some sort of data visualization in it that looks great. And if you don't have a developer on hand, or if you don't have the access to it budget wise, or even just skill wise, then that's another tool that we use quite a bit.
Are there tools aside from when you're working with folks on the ground? Are there other tools that you use for the other data for change stuff? Like, you have a big project coming out. Are there other things that you use that people might be interested in knowing about?
Yeah, in terms of on the day-to-day, usually if we have a developer in on our project, sometimes we try to develop our own tools in React just for plotting specific things. I'm just trying to think of other tools that we use beyond the kind of like basic suite. No, even in the day-to-day stuff, we try to use as much open source software as possible. And if things are created, tools specifically are created at a workshop, we then try to make a white label version of it so that we can use it ourselves, but then also that other organizations can use them as well.
Right.
And so at some point, because we've just recently released a new website and we're starting to build out our digital, let's say, presence a bit more, we're hoping to get a hub and repository up specifically for these tools, these bespoke tools that we've created, so other people can use them and build upon them.
So I'm gonna just see if anyone has any questions. Feel free to. I guess unmute is totally fine. I think you're able to unmute yourself. So if anyone has any questions, let's just pause for a second, see if anyone has any questions, and then okay, so it's just you and me. It's fine. It's just before we started, we were talking about what things look like now for Data for Change when working with these groups.
Yes.
In this atmosphere of COVID. So maybe talk about how you guys are thinking about changing things.
The current environment has really hindered the face-to-face sprint that we normally hold. So now we have to take a step back and rethink about, okay, well, what do these types of interactions mean? Can we still keep people connected, but at a safe distance? And how can we open it up to an international community? And hopefully, after this call, we're actually about to release one of those outputs from this type of collaboration, which it will be a COVID-19 repository for civil society organizations of create like open source assets that they can use for hyper-local communications to their beneficiaries. Now, taking a step back from that, we're now looking at setting up and in the process of prototyping local and regional hubs of alumni and people that are interested in participating in a Data for Change hub. And what those or what that hub will do is provide the similar type of resources and availability to our creatives, alumni network, and our creative teams to be able to continue facilitating those conversations and those types of projects. Now, there's a couple of different things that we are trying to figure out. And right now we have one going on in Egypt, one in Jordan, and one in Nairobi, and then also in Lebanon. So we've got teams there working on super hyper local content for the specific needs that have been identified through themselves and by civil society organizations on the ground, and being able to respond to that quickly. So and I'll pin you a link after, once we hit the launch button. You can include it in the links. But basically, figuring out how we can move it into the digital realm and still keep that collaboration and those connections going.
Do you have a sense of what tools? This is really a question for me.
Yeah.
Because actually, and I see a couple of my colleagues are on the line actually. So we're doing a little card sorting exercise for a new website that we're building, I think later this week, and we're going to use Figma to do the online thing. And I'm just curious, are there other tools that you anticipate using for stuff like that?
Yes, Miro.
Oh yeah.
That one is great because they've got it's basically for pre-design discovery. So figuring out, it's like a little workflow, a lot of whiteboards in it. And actually Monday has just released a whole suite of apps for their interface. And but that's a bit more closed off. But for teams collaborating and working and kind of like, Trelloing out boards, there's a lot more integration with those Monday boards now that you can use. And they even have something called a digital whiteboard that's great for just sketching things up.
Interesting.
Also, one that I haven't played around with, but I think it's called Mural, which is another one that's similar to Miro. But to be honest, it's usually Monday boards, Google Drive, and even with this repository that we're currently building, Google Sites. And there's a lot you can actually do with Google Sites, as we were talking before. But obviously it has its limitations, but in terms of getting something out there quickly that is completely responsive and functional, there's simple ways that you can quote unquote hack it and embed stuff into it. But for the most part, that has been a very, very powerful environment to work in.
Mural looks really good. Someone sent me one earlier called Draw Chat.
Draw Chat.
And the here, it's actually the IT team at Georgetown University, because I'm teaching later this summer and everything is going virtual. And so they were actually now we're going off onto whatever, but they were very smart. They sent out a long email to especially all the adjunct faculty and said, we want to flatten the curve when it comes to moving your classes online, which I thought was really smart to sort of market that way, instead of saying the week before, everybody now needs to figure out how to move everything online.
Right.
Ask your questions now. So
here's a framework. I just put one in the chat, but actually IDEO being IDEO, and I mean that in the most endearing way possible. They actually have this really, really great space called Shape. And it's a collaborative space to build. And I've signed up for it ages ago. And I'm actually now, because we're having this conversation, I think that this is actually quite a interesting environment to build out campaigns and digital products in, because there's the equivalent of a Pinterest board, and it basically takes all the best platforms and migrates it into one, but behind an IDEO GUI.
Interesting. I mean, it'd be nice. I mean, I don't work on a touch screen, but it would be nice to have one of these tools on a touch screen, right? And just be able to basically have that analog feeling.
Yes.
Right. Be able to card sort and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. There's another one, and it's the Post-its app. I know it sounds crazy,
Really?
but I love the Post-its app. Yeah, because I still do a lot of Post-it notes by myself, and I can just
Yeah.
take a photo of them. It puts them into boards for me automatically, and I can just zip those off.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah,
That's
it's
cool.
quite cool. Um, and then yeah, other than that, like it's pretty much whatever we can get our hands on and
Yeah.
just figure out how to use things for what they're not intended to be used for.
Mm-hmm. Do you do you so thinking whatever X months ahead, when you
Yeah,
do your next sprint with say a group in Beirut, let's just pick Beirut
yeah.
again. Um, do you anticipate having a different type of setup and discussion about what tools are going to work? Like I would imagine some of these tools are going to be hard to use if your internet connection is not
Yeah,
great.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
This, yeah, it's definitely going to have to be because we even deal with that now.
Mm,
With even just on communication sometimes, because some people are working with data plans, and some people just don't have great internet connections for whatever reason. Even here
yeah.
in London, like the internet drops out. Two or three people working from home, just the connections can't handle this much load, and this
Yeah.
much load from everybody at the same time makes it even worse. So we're definitely so jumping out to the theoretical, I don't have anything off the top of my head. What would be great is to be able to have less bloated digital environments to work in, and even just stripping things back to just essential. What do you need? What can we open up, and what can we collaborate with on? And even Google Docs and Google Sheets and those types of
Yeah.
frameworks are sometimes all you need. I mean, for this repository, we wireframe the whole thing in a Google Doc, and
Yeah.
just tables in a Google Doc, to be honest, just to figure things out. So it's not the most elegant. Sometimes it can be quite fussy, but I think the less sophisticated of the tool requires you to be more creative with it. And it
Yeah.
also allows you just to focus on, okay, well, what can we do with this? What's essential and what's nice to have? And how can we get this to actually work with the bare minimum of bells and whistles?
Yeah. Do you find, and I'll tell you why I'm going to ask this question,
Yeah.
but do you find that when you're using a tool like Google Sheets or Google Doc, for example, have you found that there are people or organizations that kind of like, no, that's a basic tool. We shouldn't be using something basic like that, even though it might
Yes.
be
So,
totally sufficient.
right.
But, and the reason I ask is I'm running a Twitter feed this week, and today is on presentations, and I put a note out today about presentations, and someone asked a question about making more visual slides in academia.
Yeah.
And I've heard from lots of people that like they don't want to make better slides because their academic colleagues are going to look down on them and they're not going to respond, that sort of thing. So have you found that to be the case with even some of these like basic tools that work great, but people are like, no, we need something, we need bells and whistles.
More, yeah, bells and whistles.
Yeah.
Yes. And even client side, working with, from having worked in the commercial sector and also in the nonprofit sector, it's, again, it comes down to content, and it comes down to story and the pacing of those things. And you can have the most powerful slides with just simple set typography and
Yeah.
just like basic imagery. But again, it comes down to curating that content, getting down to the essence of it. And this also applies to visualizations as well. And just what is the basic thing that I need? And if I'm adding something to it, is it simply for an aesthetic choice, or does it actually facilitate comprehension and understanding to someone who's viewing it? If it doesn't, then do I really need it? And sure, you can indulge yourself and embellish things, but it shouldn't. I mean, of course, that's how design in one aspect works, but in terms of communicating, whether it be data or a specific message, it's really, it just comes down to that that overarching story and the pacing of content and just making things clear for people. And really it's more about information hierarchy and architecture than it is about design, so to say.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I mean, you could, and people will probably scoff at this, but you could make a really cool presentation, or even, dare I say it, even a visualization with Comic Sans. You could, it can be done.
It can be done.
It can be done.
Well,
it's very difficult, but it can be done.
Well, people are, scoff at, you can't make a good data visualization with a pie chart, but
you can. You can,
mean,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so some of these kind of preconceived, or not preconceived, but some of these dogmas that have been picked up and kind of beaten into us, I think it's now more than ever is really the time to kind of pick up that flag and champion and say, actually, you know what? No, it's okay. I mean, now that we're on this topic, I'm going to bring it up. And the tornado chart has been making its rounds. So we're going there. And
everyone knew we would.
Yeah. And I absolutely love that thing. And I absolutely love it for two reasons. In principle, it's got some basic mechanics. And I think what everybody was so outraged about was how it looked. But if you take that down, you sit down, you refine it, and you pace the content, it would have been a great interactive. It would have been a great motion graphic. It would have been a fantastic, even kind of small multiples. There's myriad.
I'm going to try
myriad
to
ways that you
find
can
it.
rehash that. And if you tightened up some of the design aspects of it, like in terms of maybe color palette, maybe quality of line or rendering, then I think you would have actually quite a beautiful, insightful visualization. Is it necessarily the most intuitive thing to read at first? Maybe not, because you're experiencing it for the first time. But I don't think that type of parameters should disqualify us from exploring these types of new expressions of data, because we need them. I mean, even talking about this the other day, when you go back to that New York Times piece of the plotted line chart that's then organized chronologically on the scatter plot, I think it was pricing, miles, price per gallon, miles driven. You see it loop back on itself. It's like, wow, I didn't expect the data to do that, but it's quite an interesting piece, and it's actually super insightful.
It just gives us I'm trying to find, so people know. I mean, I found it on Twitter, but I'm trying to find the original, and it's not.
Yes.
The other thing that bothers me about it is that it's not well sourced. It says.
Yeah.
So I want so people know what we're talking about. Okay, so
Yeah.
I'll just put this one on. I mean, I don't know. I can't find the original. I can't find it on this original website, but this is what we're calling the tornado chart, whatever. So this is one that I found. And by the way, you have to, you might even not be able to copy that anymore. You might have to
actually, if you right click and go to services and go to search with Google.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, sorry, I've been in a couple of different.
You might even be able to open. Oh yeah, you can right click and do open URL at the bottom of that search. Yeah.
You can't post in there, can you? An image in there.
No.
Okay.
I was going to just share. I guess I could just share my screen. Let me share my screen real quick. So for people who don't know what we're talking about this chart. And this is not the best. This is the, there's a million of these. So
yeah.
So it's got deaths per day on the horizontal axis, and or this is the change in deaths, and this is the average number of deaths on the vertical axis. Right.
Yeah.
And so people have been given this chart a hard time. And I agree with you. I mean, I think under, and let me just see if I think there's probably just more like snark.
Even Alberto did a quick sketch up of what
Alberto
happens when
did a quick one.
Yeah, what happens, and I can't speak for him, but from his tweets, it seems like he may be in somewhere in between us.
Right.
And, even just simply graying out some of those.
Yeah, just watch me scroll, everybody. Just watch me scroll.
This really is turning into between two ferns. It's just you scrolling.
It really is. I mean, this is close-ish all right. So, but that's not it. But okay. So just some. This is like, I mean, this is terrible. This is.
Awesome.
Oh, here we go. No, we found it. Okay.
Yes, we found
Yes. Okay. See. All right.
Yeah.
So yeah. So Alberto I think he just like took a grayscale photo and just drew these lines, which like, if you did it this way, and you don't have to make it interactive, right? I mean, you could, where you could click, but like these are totally fine. I just. And then the other one you mentioned was.
From the New York Times.
It's Hannah.
I think, yeah. Sorry, I'm really bad with names.
Let's see, it should be like right at the top. There's Hannah.
Yeah, here it is. Third column.
Was this the one?
Third row. No, yes, that was, I thought you were about to click on the AR-15.
You know me. Okay, so that's bringing me to the wrong page. But this one has its miles driven per capita on this axis.
By price per gallon.
Price a gallon on this axis. And, you know, I find one.
Chronologically.
So this is like 1950 or something.
Right.
So these are, you know, called the connected scatter plot for those who don't know. I really like these graphs, but I find that 9 out of 10 times I end up in one of two places. The line is just going like one direction.
Oh yeah.
Right. It's just like a hairball and it's a nightmare. But something like this, like when the data works this way, like it's great.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, you know, that type of exploration and this comes down to another thing too. I was sitting in a data ethics call the other day, and it's like, I think maybe we also need to take a step back and slow down and maybe think about what we're publishing in the public domain and under what context as well, because there's a lot of things that are great for exploration and it's great to share them within the community, but it becomes a bit problematic when then those things make it out into the greater general public, because we are using very specific statistical visualizations that people don't necessarily have the background to be able to read. With that said, you know, simple things like the pie chart, at one point, those were new and people had to learn how to read those, as was a bar chart, as was a line chart, or any other type of kind of the now core visualization types that we use that make up our quote unquote toolkit.
Right.
But then, you know, coming into that, and even for maybe another conversation altogether, you know, we also have 5 senses. So how can we start moving beyond visualization and start looking at more, and I really like data design as a term, and I hope that we start to use it more than data visualization, because data visualization of in itself is quite limiting, because it requires the person to be able to see, but it also requires the person to be able to read. And so if there's other ways that we can start expressing data and create data expressions and experiences that are a bit more inclusive, I think it will just open up the landscape for more understanding for more people. And, you know, to be honest, like, I love charts, but also it would be nice to, you know, and this is one example that I love from Olafur Ellison, Ice Watch. It was, I'll pull it up for you, Ice Watch. But basically it was an installation with pieces of the Arctic ice shelf that were positioned in a clock. And here it is. Okay, let me pull it up so people can know what we're talking about. And basically, what you have is a clock that's composed of ice that was cut and shipped. Now, there's a lot of ethical questions around this. Cut and shipped from the Iceland green shelf and installed in, I think, 5 different countries at different times. But now what I think is really cool about this, and I would actually call this a data experience, a data expression, or even a data visualization, is that I've got a piece of content in front of me. I've literally got a piece of the Greenland ice shelf in front of me. I can see it melt, I can touch it, I can feel its temperature. Now, if you were to take that and to map the rate of melt back in Greenland to what you're experiencing in front of you, there's more of a direct connection to that. And it works for all ages. You know, if you have somebody that's a child, it opens up an entry point where they can feel something, and they may not necessarily understand what they're looking at, but at least that dialogue is started.
Right.
And
although I'm
so,
looking through here, are you concerned about these kids who are licking these ice shelves? Because
yes,
I would worry.
ice is not salt, and obviously now post COVID, it's not
Right. Yeah. It's not.
it's
Probably
not
not the
necessarily
strategy, but
sanitary, and
right.
everybody's touching it. I doubt this would fly now, but
Right. But yeah.
if
Yeah. Yeah.
we use this as an example, and even I wouldn't say an extreme example, but it's quite what's the word that I'm looking for? It's quite grandiose. It's a big gesture, and
Yeah.
obviously
Yeah.
you can't do this for everything, but can we start to take elements of this and incorporate this more into the data storytelling landscape? And I mean, even beyond the scrolly coaster, and
Mm-hmm.
having charts whiz in and whiz out, and just kind of taking stock of how can we communicate this data, and how can we communicate it in a more effective and emotive way, obviously keeping to what's the keeping to the truth of the data, not obviously skewing it to be able to drive a specific political message or agenda, keeping as
Yeah.
honest as possible to it, and being open and transparent. But I mean, every time that you select a specific data set, there's inherent bias in it. So it's
Yeah. Well, what I'm struck about whenever I mean this I've been scrolling through this ice shelf piece, which is really great. Whenever I have these conversations with people about however you want to call it, physical data, data
yeah,
design, or I always think about how museums do this, right?
yeah,
Like museum curators, they are experts in this, right? Because
yes,
they are trying to communicate information to people who are probably not data. 90% of them are not data experts, and a lot of them are probably kids, right? Like
yeah,
here in DC, outside the Air and Space Museum, they have these little posts with a scaled version of planets, and
oh
so
really,
it's like like Earth is like right
yeah,
outside, and then like 3 blocks away is whatever, Saturn, right? And
right,
so and
that's a
it
really great way
feel
of
it
scale,
right, exactly, and it feels more visceral when
right,
you do it that way, that oh, look how far I have to walk to
yeah.
understand these distances. So
I think in the early days of Vox, there was something that they did where they actually made a video about explaining the size. What's the size? Just the distance from Earth to the moon. And I don't know. They were
they
down in New York
might,
City, and then they were like we have to hop on a train and go to Boston and travel. We would have to do that 10 times,
right,
because
right,
it's it's about also communicating scale, and at what
yeah,
scale does it become too large and abstract for us to comprehend? So what's the next level in, what's the next level in, and what's the next
right,
level in? And if we start using that as an approach, or more actively and more commonly, then I think it becomes a lot easier to communicate those larger messages. And
yeah,
that's always been an issue with climate change, is that it's such a huge, massive topic to tackle. But the more that we
yeah,
can communicate that type of data in a scale in which we can understand and interact with it, then we can start building out from there.
yeah. His name right now, Dan Kahneman was on the Hidden Brain podcast. This was probably like 2 years ago at some point, and he was talking about this idea of communicating climate change, and the argument he was making is that the reason why people can't fully grasp it is for two reasons. One, the scale is too enormous,
Yeah.
and B, it's not an immediate thing. I mean, you could argue it's an immediate thing, but it's not an immediate, like it's not
No,
a
it's
car about
slow.
to hit you, right?
It's
Yeah,
slow. It's
it's
slow
slow. Yeah,
change. And it's like
right.
what Hans Rosling talks about. We
Yeah,
celebrate the immediacy of disaster because positive change is slow.
right.
And it's hard to communicate that.
Yeah, I had this problem when I was working in the government, and it's a similar problem now. I mean, the U.S. Congress passed a $2 trillion bill. How do
Right.
you get your head around what $2 trillion is? Like
Yeah.
it's impossible, and you can't just convert it to like cans of beans, because it's two
No.
trillion cans of beans, right? Like I mean, you haven't
Yeah.
solved the problem. You just
Yeah.
change it from dollars to cans, like
Yeah.
and
It's not. So what does that mean to me? Like, and also, like, even if you equate it to, yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, I did.
right? Even
Yeah,
if you do these, and I'll look this up later. But someone
yeah,
had done a thing of like, if you stacked up $100 bills and you have them in this big, you'd
right,
stack it from here. It'd be, six Empire
right,
State Buildings tall, and you're
right.
like, okay,
Okay.
like that doesn't really like I get pretty tall, right? Like
Yeah.
that still
What
doesn't help
happens
me.
when
So
it hits the stratosphere and outside that? Does it?
I think everybody gets $100. I don't
Nice.
just I
Yeah,
just
no,
want
no,
to know
it's
how do you stack it? Yeah.
how do you stack it? How do you keep it there? No, I know it's there's so many questions.
Do you put lights on the side of it so birds don't hit it? Like, what do you do with the stack of dollar bills? That's really,
Yeah,
these are the important
yeah,
questions.
yeah. No, but it's tough to, yeah, it's tough to make it digestible.
Yeah,
But that's
absolutely.
ultimately part of our jobs as
Right.
communicators, or that use data to communicate. And I think that that's one of the areas that, it's always been there, it's talked about, but it would be nice to have more open conversations about it.
Conversations about it. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Go ahead.
oh, no, I was just gonna say, there's, because it's also, there's a level of maturity that's coming out too, because in a way the data design or data visualization landscape also, because it's composed of so many different actors. The
Right.
other thing too is that we can also look at all of our different landscapes and bring the growing pains from a design perspective, from a policy perspective, from a data science perspective to the table,
Yep.
and communicate those, because everything that we do ultimately has to, no one single person, there are some, but as a whole, no one single person obtains all of the possible skills to be able to create
Yeah.
data visualizations and data experiences. It takes a team of communication experts, it takes a team of data experts, it takes a team of editorial and journalism experts to be able to come together, sit at the table, have a conversation, be like, where are we going, what are we doing, where are you coming from, where am I coming from, and what's
Right.
our common perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I call those the unicorns because they don't exist. I mean,
No, no, no.
right. I mean,
and
just,
and,
yeah.
and sure, you do have a lot of people that overlap in different areas, but there's always one
Yeah.
key strength that, and it's good to know and be knowledgeable of everybody's jobs to a
Right.
certain degree. But it's like one of the things that we have in the office. It's like, I know where my expertise ends, you know where your expertise ends, so let's either find someone or just trust the next person to pick up where that needs to go.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're in total agreement, and I think the other
Yeah,
thing that I try to tell, especially students, is that not only do you not know everything, right? But the other thing to keep in mind is that all of the pieces of this little puzzle, they're all equally difficult, right?
yeah,
Like, a lot of researchers that I run into are like, we need a website, can you make it quickly, right?
yeah,
I need an interactive blah blah blah, like, can you just make it? Well, no, it's, no one
yeah,
said, can you do your research in
exactly.
3 days? You took you 2 years. Like, why is this other thing not,
Less,
it should,
yeah,
right. It's not less.
yeah,
It is
equally as
as important.
important. Yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah, yeah,
It's accomplishing a different type of role, right? So
yes,
you're doing the research or collecting the data. But if you don't have the communications expert or the data viz expert, then no one's going to see it. So,
yeah, yeah.
it's just different. We've got about 10 minutes. So I just wanted to see if anyone else, I mean, it's just been the Mike and John show today, which is fine. Um, I just want to see if anyone had any, we kind of went off on this fun rant. I just want to see if anyone else had any questions or comments about what we've been talking about.
Or totally call me out or John
Right.
out.
Well, no, I mean, call Michael out. You can call Michael out. You're going to call me out. You just, hold on to that, and that's fine. I mean, we must be doing something right because we have more people than what we started with, and
Well,
yet
that's
no one's
good.
asking questions. So that's good. Yeah.
The word has been spreading. Who are these two lunatics on
It's,
Zoom?
it's just my mom opening new accounts. That's all it
Yeah.
is. She's on 40 different computers now. So, um, can to
Yes.
this
We're flashing.
Oh, we're flashing. We had a question. Will the recording? Yes,
Ooh.
there is. This is being
Oh,
recorded.
Oh, this is being recorded?
Yeah. Did you not know?
I missed the fine print.
Were you gonna wear a tie?
No, I would, yeah. Oh, wow.
I'll literally put a green screen behind you, but it'll just be
Oh,
green.
perfect. It'd just be
Yeah.
green. Amazing.
So Gregory has a question about starting points, which I
Or,
assume, yeah. So Gregory, if you want to
yeah,
unmute,
hop in the chat. Yeah.
that's fine. Maybe he might not have might not be able to. So
Okay.
so maybe on data viz, I was going to ask really a starting point. If you were thinking about, if you were starting Data for Change today, it was a new organization, what would you look for for a team, to build up a team?
To build up a team, well, it would reflect the teams that we have in the sprints, but then eventually, so, some sort of visual designer that has a design focus, some sort of person that's working in an editorial background or journalistic background, some sort of data scientist or data researcher, a general researcher, a developer or creative technologist. And I would actually also start to throw in, people like psychologists, ecologists, sociologists, and then of course always and I forgot to mention this earlier, is that we always have, when we're working with the civil society organizations, either the civil society representative is a representative of the beneficiary group that they are working with, or having someone from that beneficiary group at the table.
Yeah.
And in tech in general, or in design in general, that's often one of the voices that's not always represented at the table.
Right.
Because you can sit and design in a vacuum, and once you put it out there, it's like, oh, actually there's a lot of unintended consequences that we didn't think about. Had we had a person who this was made for at the table, this could have been totally avoided to begin with.
Right.
So it really all depends on the challenge or the issue that's trying to be tackled and solved, and just basically building a core team that you can connect other disciplines into.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. So that means it comes from like on high,
right,
down to the communities. So Samuel has a question. Samuel, if you want to unmute, that's fine. What about data design for people or communities with low or no literacy? We talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think it's specific to the design piece.
Yeah, it all depends on the challenge that you are trying to tackle, and also just sitting down with people who are working with this community and trying to suss out, well, what are the means of communication that do happen on day to day. So, for example, we were working with a group at our Nairobi sprint with an organization called Together from Ethiopia, and they work with visually impaired persons to provide internet and computer training. And they provided a whole host of scenarios. So how do you design data visualization? And this is why the term is kind of awkward. How do you design data visualization for someone who has visual impairment? Well, it's while some aspects of it may be visualized, there's other aspects that need to be brought into it. So that's why I prefer data design. So how do you then do that type of data design? Well, you have to sit down with the group and figure out, okay, well, what's their day-to-day interactions and how can we tap into that, and then figure out how to translate data into forms or expressions that communicate to them. Now, that is a very simplistic way of looking at it, but for this particular group, there was a sonification, because the radio and audibles are a big part of their training and coursework. And so the team came up with a couple of contextual music pieces that specifically related to this project. And I'll put a link to it up in the chat. And so post-workshop, this was then translated into sheet music that could then be distributed to schools that were specifically working with visually impaired children, so that they could at least hear the data. Now, of course, there's a learning curve to that, and there's a whole, entry point and learning curve to that. But we have to start somewhere and go somewhere. So yeah, it all really depends on if we take sight away, and even if we take hearing away, what are we left with? We're left with sight, or sorry, with smell and taste and physical touch. So what can and how can we translate data into that? I think actually, side tangent, Miriam, Quick, and Steph have a new book coming out relatively soon, and I think I don't know if it's a kid's book or if they have
I'm trying to see if it's on Amazon yet. It's not. So
it's not. Okay.
But at least in my version. But yeah, so that book, I'll just talk quickly about it.
Yeah.
It's almost out of time. But that book is basically it is all essentially visuals and data about the physical book itself. So it's if you had this many books, and like this is how much the paper weighs, or visualization how much the paper on this page weighs, or how many molecules.
It's your reference point. It's like the key to all of the visualizations.
Yeah, which is really clever and fascinating. I'm super excited to see it. Yeah.
So I'm going to post now the link to the project that I was just talking about called Hear the Blind Spot. And so it's available in English and in Amharic. It's super high contrast. It's really big when you actually go to the live link, which I'll also post. And once you kick the site off, it basically narrates. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. Basically, Desta then kicks off her narrative journey, and there's some data moments in there that have been sonified. And the things that you hear that are sonified, those are the elements that have been translated into sheet music to be distributed to schools.
Oh, interesting.
And also, this particular group is going to provide us with some songs and about COVID-19 that's what they're using on the radio in Ethiopia to communicate the issues and misconception, common myth busting through song.
Interesting. That's really cool. Well, we filled the hour.
We did.
Yeah.
We did.
I mean, not that anybody's surprised. If they know us. Yeah. They literally didn't need anybody to show up. They would have just done it anyways.
Oh, absolutely. This is when we were talking the other day.
That's right. All right. So I'm going to say
thanks
to everybody. I know people have to go. Michael, thanks so much. This was great.
Thank you for everybody for your ears. And if you have any questions outside of this, John, you can share Twitter handles and also email address if it's for a closed group. And then I'll send you a couple more links to share. Are you going to post links at all?
I'll post all of these links. If I have time, I'll put them on my Twitter feed later today, but we'll put them with the recording. Jenny's going to go watch Between Two Ferns, which is great.
Nice.
Yeah. I'll put all the links out there so people have them. And just a quick note for those who are interested, more this week, tomorrow at, sometime 1:00 Eastern with Doug Elmendorf, formerly of CBO, now at Harvard. And then Friday is at noon with Claudia Sam, who's now Director of Macroeconomic Policy at the Center for Equitable Growth, which will be really interesting. I'll put those down here. And feel free to reach out to either of us with any questions or anything like that. And thanks, everybody. Stay healthy, stay well. And Michael, thanks a lot. I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. All right. See you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye, Mom.
Bye, Mom.